The stallion's hooves pounded against the dusty trail as Zachariah Cole urged the animal faster, desperate to outrun the memories that clung to him like a second skin. The year was 1878, and for the past 3 years, he'd been trying to escape the ghost of his wife Sarah and their unborn child. But no matter how far he rode across the Montana territory, grief followed him like his own shadow. The setting sun painted the vast prairie in hues of gold and crimson as Zach finally slowed his horse to a walk. Sweetwater Creek was just ahead, a small but growing cattle town where he'd taken work as a ranch foreman. He wasn't looking for anything permanent. Nothing ever felt permanent since the day he'd buried Sarah. But winter was approaching, and even a man running from his past needed somewhere to weather the cold months. "Come on, Thunder," he murmured to his chestnut stallion, patting the animal's sweaty neck. "Let's get you settled for the night." The town of Sweetwater Creek appeared on the horizon, a collection of wooden buildings stretched along a single main street with the occasional side alley. Nothing special, but it had what a cowboy needed: a livery, a general store, a saloon, and enough distance from his former life in Colorado. Zach guided Thunder toward the livery stable at the edge of town. The familiar smells of hay, leather, and horses greeted him as he dismounted. His muscles ached from the long ride, but physical pain was a welcome distraction from what lay beneath. "Mr. Cole," nodded the stable boy, a gangly youth of 15 with freckles scattered across his sun-burned face. "Rough day on the range, aren't they all, Jimmy?" Zach replied, handing over the reins. "Make sure he gets extra oats tonight. He earned it." "Yes, sir." Jimmy led the horse away, leaving Zach alone with his thoughts once more. The boarding house where Zach rented a room was on the opposite end of town, forcing him to walk the length of Main Street. He kept his eyes forward, avoiding the gazes of townsfolk. 3 months in Sweetwater Creek, and he still felt like a stranger, which suited him fine. Getting too close meant eventually sharing his past, and that was something he couldn't bear. As he passed the general store, the door swung open and a woman stepped out, arms laden with packages. Too distracted by her burden, she didn't see Zach until they collided. The packages tumbled to the ground, and Zach instinctively reached out to steady her. "I'm so sorry, madam," he said, quickly releasing her arm and bending to gather the scattered items. "I wasn't watching where I was going." "Neither was I, it seems," she replied, kneeling beside him. Zach glanced up and felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a moment of genuine surprise. The woman before him had eyes the color of summer sage, set in a face framed by auburn hair that escaped in wisps from beneath a practical bonnet. But it wasn't her beauty that caught him off guard, it was the quiet strength in her gaze, absent of the pity or curiosity he'd grown accustomed to seeing. "You're Mr. Cole, aren't you?" she asked, accepting a package he handed to her. "The foreman from Rocking S Ranch," Zach nodded, suddenly conscious of the trail dust coating his clothes and the several days' worth of stubble on his face. "Yes, madam, Zachariah Cole. I'm Emma Thorne. I arrived last week to take over the schoolhouse." She smiled, and something inside Zach's chest tightened uncomfortably. "I've heard about you from my students." "Nothing good, I expect," he said, helping her to her feet. "On the contrary. Jimmy Spencer says you're the best horseman in 3 counties, and little Mary Wilson believes you fought in the war alongside General Custer." Despite himself, Zach felt the corner of his mouth twitch. "Jimmy exaggerates, and I was just a boy during the war." "Children and their stories," Emma said with a soft laugh. She adjusted her packages in her arms. "Well, thank you for your help, Mr. Cole. Let me carry those for you," Zach offered, surprising himself as much as her. "Where are you headed?" Hesitation flickered across her face, and for a moment, Zach thought she would refuse. Most respectable women in town kept their distance from the quiet, brooding ranch foreman. "The schoolhouse," she finally said. "It's just past the church." Zach took the packages, careful not to brush her fingers with his own. "I know it," he said simply. They walked in silence for several moments, Zach acutely aware of the curious glances from townsfolk as they passed. It had been a long time since he'd walked alongside a woman, any woman, and Emma Thorne was certainly drawing attention in her own right as the new schoolteacher. "How are you finding Sweetwater Creek?" he asked, searching for something to say. It's different from Boston, she replied. But the people have been kind for the most part. Boston. Zach couldn't hide his surprise. That's a long way to travel for a teaching position. Something passed across her expression, a shadow quickly concealed. Sometimes distance is exactly what's needed, she said softly. The words struck a chord in Zach. Here was someone else running from something, though what could drive a proper Boston lady to the Montana territory, he couldn't imagine. They reached the schoolhouse, a modest building with a small bell tower and freshly painted shutters. Zach handed over the packages, careful to maintain a respectful distance. "Thank you, Mr. Cole," Emma said, meeting his eyes directly. "Perhaps our paths will cross again." "Perhaps," he replied, tipping his hat before turning to leave. As he continued toward his boarding house, Zach realized his steps felt lighter than when he'd entered town. The encounter, brief as it was, had momentarily pushed aside the weight of his memories. But as he climbed the stairs to his sparse room, he firmly shut the door on any thoughts of Emma Thorne and her sage-green eyes. Some men were meant for second chances, but Zachariah Cole wasn't one of them. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with frost coating the grass and the promise of winter in the air. Zach rose before the sun, as was his habit, and headed to the livery to collect Thunder. The day's work at Rocking S Ranch would keep his mind occupied rounding up stray cattle, mending fences, and preparing the herd for the coming winter. As he rode out of town, he caught sight of a familiar figure walking briskly toward the schoolhouse. Emma Thorne wore a dark blue dress today, with a matching shawl pulled tight around her shoulders against the morning chill. Almost as if sensing his gaze, she turned and lifted a hand in greeting. Zach tipped his hat in response, then urged Thunder into a trot, leaving the town and its new schoolteacher behind. The Rocking S spread across 5,000 acres of prime grazing land, owned by Samuel Sawyer, a former Union officer who'd come west after the war and built an empire from nothing. Zach respected the man who paid fair wages and asked few questions about his employees' pasts. "Morning, boss," called Wade, one of the younger cowhands, as Zach rode into the ranch yard. "Mr. Sawyer wants to see you in the main house." Zach dismounted, handing Thunder's reins to Wade. "Did he say what for?" "Nope, but he's got company. Fancy-dressed fella from back east." Curiosity piqued, Zach headed toward the 2-story ranch house. Samuel Sawyer had built it for his wife, who died of influenza before she could see it completed. Another man who understood loss, though unlike Zach, Sawyer had channeled his grief into building something lasting. The ranch owner met Zach on the porch, his weathered face breaking into a rare smile. "Cole, good timing. Got someone I want you to meet." Beside Sawyer stood a man in his 40s, wearing a suit that had clearly been tailored in some eastern city. His hands were smooth, unmarked by the calluses of ranch work, but his eyes were sharp and assessing. "This is Henry Baldwin," Sawyer said. "Investor from Chicago looking to expand railroad access through the territory. Henry, this is Zachariah Cole, best foreman I've had in 10 years. The men shook hands, Baldwin's grip firmer than Zach expected. "Mr. Sawyer speaks highly of you," Baldwin said. "Says you know this land better than most natives." "I've covered some ground," Zach admitted modestly. "Baldwin here is surveying possible routes for a new spur line," Sawyer explained. "Wants someone who knows the terrain to guide him for a couple of days. I told him you're our man." Zach hesitated. He preferred working alone, and playing guide to an Eastern businessman wasn't how he'd planned to spend his time. But he owed Sawyer, who'd hired him without references and paid him well. "When do we leave?" he asked. "Tomorrow morning," Baldwin replied. "Early, if you don't mind." "I have a schedule to keep." Sawyer clapped Zach on the shoulder. "Take what supplies you need from the storehouse. Consider it special assignment pay." After discussing the details with Baldwin, Zach headed back to the bunkhouse to inform the other hands of his absence. 2 days guiding a railroad man through the territory, it wasn't ideal, but it was better than sitting in town with nothing but memories for company. As dusk approached, Zach rode back toward Sweetwater Creek, a list of supplies in his pocket for the journey ahead. The general store would be closing soon, and he needed to stock up before morning. The town was quieter than usual, most folks already home for supper. As Zach tied Thunder outside the store, he noticed light spilling from the schoolhouse windows. Curious, he paused. School would have ended hours ago. Through the window, he could see Emma Thorne at her desk, bent over what appeared to be a stack of papers. She worked by lamplight, occasionally pushing a strand of hair behind her ear as she concentrated. Zach found himself walking toward the schoolhouse before he could question why. He knocked lightly on the door, startling Emma from her work. "Mr. Cole," she said, rising from her desk as he entered. "This is unexpected." "I saw the light," he explained, suddenly feeling foolish. "Thought I'd make sure everything was all right." A smile touched her lips. "Just catching up on lessons for tomorrow. Time got away from me, I'm afraid." Zach nodded, noticing the simple furnishings of the schoolroom: rows of desks, a blackboard, and shelves lined with well-worn books. A small, pot-bellied stove provided warmth against the evening chill. "It's getting dark," he said. "Wouldn't be right to let you walk home alone." Emma's eyebrows rose slightly. "That's very gallant, Mr. Cole, but I've managed on my own thus far." "I'm sure you have," he replied. "But there's been talk of a mountain lion coming down from the hills. Rancher lost 2 calves last week." It wasn't entirely a lie. There had been signs of a predator, though no confirmed sightings near town. Emma studied him for a moment, then nodded. "In that case, I appreciate the escort. Let me gather my things." As she collected her papers and extinguished the lamp, Zach waited by the door, hat in hand. He couldn't explain the impulse that had brought him here, only that seeing her alone in the schoolhouse had stirred something protective in him. They walked in companionable silence, the first stars appearing in the darkening sky above. Emma lived in a small cottage behind Mrs. Whittaker's boarding house, the same place where many single women in town resided under the watchful eye of the widow. "I'm leaving town for a couple of days," Zach found himself saying as they approached the cottage. "Guiding a railroad investor through the territory." Emma glanced at him, surprise evident in her expression. "That sounds like important work." "Just a job," he shrugged, "but I thought. Well, if you saw me riding out with a stranger, I didn't want you to think I was leaving for good." The words hung between them, revealing more than Zach had intended. "Why should it matter what the schoolteacher thought of his comings and goings? I appreciate you telling me," Emma said softly. They reached her door and she turned to face him. "Be careful out there, Mr. Cole. The territory can be unforgiving this time of year." "I've weathered worse," he replied. For a moment neither moved, then Emma extended her hand. "Thank you for the escort." Zach took her hand briefly, the touch sending an unexpected warmth through him. "Good night, Miss Thorne." As he walked away, leading Thunder by the reins, Zach tried to make sense of the unfamiliar feelings stirring within him. 3 years of carefully constructed walls, and somehow this schoolteacher from Boston had found a crack. But he couldn't afford to dwell on it now. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, and Zachariah Cole had long ago learned not to look beyond the day at hand. The next morning arrived with a biting chill that promised snow before long. Zach met Henry Baldwin at the arranged spot just outside town, the businessman already mounted on a sturdy gelding provided by Sawyer. "Ready for our adventure, Mr. Cole?" Baldwin asked, his enthusiasm apparent despite the early hour. "It's just Zach," he corrected, adjusting the supplies on Thunder's back. "And out here, it's less about adventure and more about staying alive." Baldwin chuckled. "Point taken, lead on then." They rode northwest, following game trails that wound through stands of pine and across rocky plateaus. Zach kept a steady pace, mindful of Baldwin's less experienced riding. The man asked intelligent questions about the terrain, making notes in a small leather-bound book. By midday, they'd covered considerable ground, stopping to rest the horses beside a clear stream. As they ate a simple lunch of jerky and hardtack, Baldwin revealed more about his purpose. This railroad spur would change everything for communities like Sweetwater Creek, he explained, tracing potential routes on a map spread between them. Cattle to market in half the time, supplies from the east without months of delay. And profit for your investors, Zach added. Baldwin smiled wryly. "I won't deny it, but progress benefits everyone, doesn't it? Even reluctant guides." I'm not against progress, Zach said, folding the map carefully, just wary of what comes with it. You mean change? Baldwin studied him thoughtfully. You strike me as a man who's seen his share of it. Zach didn't respond, busying himself with checking Thunder's saddle. His past wasn't something he discussed, especially with strangers. They continued riding through the afternoon, eventually making camp in a sheltered ravine as darkness fell. Zach built a small fire while Baldwin unpacked his bedroll with surprising competence for a city man. You've done this before, Zach observed. Baldwin nodded, settling beside the fire. I wasn't always a businessman. Spent 2 years surveying in Wyoming Territory before the war. What changed? Life, Baldwin said simply. Met my wife, started a family. Some dreams get set aside for others. The words hit too close to home, and Zach retreated into silence, staring into the flames. His own dreams had died with Sarah, buried in the same grave that held her and their unborn child. You know, Baldwin said after a while, my wife Elizabeth lost our first child, nearly lost her too. Zach's head snapped up, startled by the man's perceptiveness. I recognize the look, Baldwin continued gently. That hollow feeling like part of you is missing, carried it myself for years. With all due respect, Zach said, his voice tight, you don't know what I've lost. You're right, I don't, Baldwin agreed, but I know what it's like to think life is over at 30, to believe nothing good can ever come again. Zach stood abruptly. I'll take first watch, get some sleep. He walked to the edge of their camp, putting distance between himself and Baldwin's two accurate observations. The night sky stretched overhead, countless stars scattered across the darkness. Sarah had loved the stars, often dragging Zach outside to marvel at them. They make our troubles seem small, don't they? She'd say, her head resting on his shoulder, but her death hadn't felt small. It had consumed his entire world, leaving nothing but ashes where their future should have been. As the night wore on, Zach's thoughts drifted unexpectedly to Emma Thorne. What had brought her to Sweetwater Creek? What shadows lurked behind those clear green eyes? There was a story there, one he found himself wanting to know, despite his better judgment. When Baldwin relieved him for the second watch, Zach settled into his bedroll, sleep coming easier than it had in months. The second day of their journey took them through rougher country, following a route Baldwin believed ideal for the railroad. By late afternoon, heavy clouds had gathered and the temperature dropped sharply. We should head back, Zach advised, eyeing the sky. Storms coming in faster than I expected. Baldwin nodded, making one final notation in his book. I have what I need. Lead the way, Zach. They turned toward Sweetwater Creek, but the storm moved in quickly. Snow began to fall, light at first, then thickening until visibility was reduced to mere feet ahead. The wind picked up, driving the snow horizontally and cutting through their heavy coats. We need shelter. Zach called over the howling wind. There's an old trapper's cabin about a mile east, Baldwin nodded, hunching lower in his saddle as they altered course. The horses struggled through deepening snow, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Zach kept his eyes fixed on the terrain, searching for landmarks nearly obscured by the worsening blizzard. When the cabin finally appeared, it was little more than a dark shape against the white landscape. Zach dismounted quickly, leading Thunder to the small lean-to attached to one side of the structure. Baldwin followed suit, his movements stiff with cold. The cabin's interior was dusty but intact, with a small stone fireplace and crude furnishings left by previous occupants. Zach worked quickly to start a fire while Baldwin brought in their supplies. Quite the adventure after all, Baldwin remarked, his attempt at humor undermined by chattering teeth. Zach didn't respond, focused on coaxing flames from the kindling. Once the fire was burning steadily, he checked on the horses, ensuring they were sheltered from the worst of the storm. When he returned, Baldwin had arranged their supplies and was warming his hands by the fire. Will it last long? He asked, nodding toward the storm raging outside. Hard to say, Zach replied. Could blow over by morning or last for days. Mountain weather's unpredictable this time of year. Well, I'm grateful for your knowledge of the area, Baldwin said. Without that cabin, we'd be in dire straits. Zach merely nodded, unpacking provisions for a simple meal. The cabin had a single window, now completely covered in snow, and the wind whistled through cracks in the walls despite the structure's relative soundness. As they ate beans warmed over the fire, Baldwin seemed content to let silence reign. It wasn't until they'd finished eating that he spoke again, his tone thoughtful. "Earlier, I overstepped," he said. "Presuming to know your circumstances, I apologize." Zach stared into the fire, weighing his response. Part of him wanted to dismiss the apology, to maintain the wall between himself and this perceptive stranger. But something about the isolated cabin, cut off from the world by the howling storm, loosened his usual reserve. "Her name was Sarah," he said finally, the words feeling strange on his tongue after so long unspoken. "We were married 3 years when the fever took her. She was carrying our first child." Baldwin remained silent, allowing Zach the space to continue or not as he chose. "I was away when it happened," Zach went on, the familiar guilt rising like bile. "Drove a herd to Kansas City. By the time I got back, she was already buried." "I'm sorry," Baldwin said simply. 3 years ago now," Zach added, as if the passage of time somehow diminished the loss. "Been moving ever since, and has it helped?" Baldwin asked. The moving, Zach considered the question. Not really, but staying felt worse. Baldwin nodded, understanding in his eyes. "After we lost our first child, Elizabeth couldn't bear to be in our home. We moved 3 times in 2 years. But the grief followed, as I suspect you've discovered." "So what changed?" Zach asked, genuinely curious. "Time partly," Baldwin admitted. "But mostly Elizabeth. She refused to let sorrow define our lives forever, started volunteering at an orphanage, then insisted we try again for a family." "And did you have more children?" Baldwin smiled, reaching into his coat to withdraw a small photograph. He handed it to Zach, who saw a handsome woman surrounded by 3 children of varying ages. "Our youngest, James, just turned 10, Baldwin said proudly. "The girls are 14 and 16 now." Zach handed back the photograph, an uncomfortable mixture of emotions churning within him. Envy for what Baldwin had recovered, fear of hoping for anything similar, and beneath it all, a persistent ache for what he'd lost. "Not everyone gets a second chance," he said finally. "True enough," Baldwin agreed, tucking away the photograph. "But those who do often don't recognize it until it's staring them in the face." The conversation shifted to safer topics as the evening wore on, but Baldwin's words lingered in Zach's mind as he drifted off to sleep. The storm still raging outside their shelter. Morning brought clarity, both in weather and thought. The storm had passed during the night, leaving a transformed landscape of pristine white snow stretching as far as the eye could see. The sun shone brilliantly overhead, turning the scene into a dazzling display that momentarily blinded Zach as he stepped outside the cabin. "Magnificent," Baldwin breathed, joining him. "Worth enduring the storm for this view alone." Zach had to agree, though his practical nature quickly asserted itself. "Snow's deep, but the horses can manage. We should reach Sweetwater Creek by nightfall if we push." They set out after a quick breakfast, following the sun south and east toward town. The going was slow at first, but as they reached lower elevations, the snow thinned, making travel easier. By late afternoon, familiar landmarks appeared, and Zach felt an unexpected anticipation as Sweetwater Creek came into view, smoke rising from chimneys against the winter sky. He found himself wondering if Emma had worried during the storm, if she'd spared a thought for the cowboy and his eastern companion caught in the blizzard. Such thoughts were dangerous, he knew. Attachment meant vulnerability, and Zach had sworn never to make himself vulnerable again. Yet he couldn't deny the quickening of his pulse as they rode into town, nor the way his eyes searched for a glimpse of auburn hair among the townsfolk moving about their business. They reached the Rocking S Ranch as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the snow-covered yard. Sawyer met them at the main house, relief evident on his weathered face. "Thought you boys might have gotten caught in that blow," he said, helping Baldwin dismount. "Glad to see you made it back in one piece." "Thanks to your foreman," Baldwin replied, stamping snow from his boots. Man knows the territory like the back of his hand. While Baldwin and Sawyer discussed the survey findings, Zach saw to the horses, the familiar routine a welcome return to normalcy after the unexpected intimacy of their shelter-bound conversations. You heading into town?" Wade asked as Zach finished rubbing down Thunder. "Some of us are going to the saloon to celebrate making it through the storm." Zach hesitated. His usual inclination would be to decline, to retreat to his solitary room at the boarding house. But something, perhaps Baldwin's words about second chances, or perhaps just the exhilaration of surviving the blizzard, made him nod. "Might join you later," he said, surprising Wade and himself equally. After cleaning up and changing into fresh clothes, Zach rode back to Sweetwater Creek. The town had taken on a festive air, with lanterns glowing warmly in windows and people greeting each other with the special camaraderie that follows a shared ordeal. Zach stabled Thunder and headed toward the Frontier Saloon, where piano music and raucous laughter spilled into the street. Before he reached it, however, a familiar figure caught his eye. Emma Thorne stood outside the general store, apparently waiting as the shopkeeper locked up for the night. She wore a red woolen cloak, the color vivid against the snow-covered street, and her cheeks were flushed from the cold. Zach found himself changing direction, drawn to her like a moth to flame. "Miss Thorne," he called. She turned, surprise giving way to a warm smile that reached her eyes. "Mr. Cole, you made it back safely." "Just barely," he admitted, coming to stand before her. "Got caught in the worst of the storm, had to shelter in an old trapper's cabin." "How frightening," she said, genuine concern in her voice. "When the blizzard hit, I feared for anyone caught out in it." "You worried for a rough cowboy?" he asked, a faint smile touching his lips. Emma's gaze held his steadily. "I worry for any soul in harm's way, Mr. Cole, even rough cowboys." The shopkeeper emerged, nodding to them both before heading toward his own home. Emma adjusted her packages and Zach automatically reached to help. "Allow me," he said, taking the heavier parcels. "Thank you," she replied, "though I'm beginning to think you make a habit of rescuing me from my burdens." "Happy to be of service," Zach said, falling into step beside her as they walked toward her cottage. "Besides, I wanted to ask how the school fared during the storm." "Roof leaked in the corner and we'll need to replace one window," Emma sighed. But the children were more excited than frightened. To them, it was a grand adventure. "The resilience of youth," Zach observed. Emma glanced at him curiously. "You sound like a man much older than you appear, Mr. Cole." "Some experiences age a person beyond their years," he replied, then immediately regretted the somber tone. To his surprise, Emma nodded in understanding. "Yes, they do," she said softly. "Life can be unforgiving that way." They reached her cottage, and Zach set the packages on the small porch. Emma didn't immediately go inside, instead turning to face him with an unexpected request. "Would you like to come in for coffee? It's the least I can offer after your help." Zach hesitated, acutely aware of the impropriety of entering a single woman's home, especially at dusk. "I wouldn't want to cause talk," he said carefully. Emma smiled, a hint of mischief in her eyes. "Mr. Cole, I'm a schoolteacher. People talk regardless of what I do. Besides, Mrs. Whitaker watches from her window like a hawk. Your reputation is safe with me." Against his better judgment, Zach found himself nodding. Coffee would be welcome. The interior of Emma's cottage was modest, but welcoming, with simple furniture and touches that spoke of an educated mind. Books stacked neatly on shelves, a writing desk by the window, and a small collection of pressed flowers framed on one wall. "Please sit," Emma said, gesturing to a chair by the pot-bellied stove while she removed her cloak. "I'll put the coffee on." Zach sat awkwardly, hat in hand, watching as she moved efficiently about the small kitchen area. There was a grace to her movements, a quiet confidence that spoke of a woman comfortable in her own skin despite whatever circumstances had brought her west. "Your home is very orderly," he commented, searching for something to say. Emma laughed, a genuinely amused sound. "A diplomatic observation, Mr. Cole. Most would call it sparse." "No, I meant it as a compliment," he clarified. "Everything has its place, shows character." "Thank you then," she said, bringing 2 steaming cups to the small table between them. "Though I confess, most of my books and belongings are still in Boston. What you see is what I could carry on the train." Zach accepted the coffee, the warmth seeping through the cup into his cold fingers. "May I ask what brought you to Sweetwater Creek? It's a long way from Boston." Emma's expression sobered, and she took a sip of coffee before answering. A fresh start, she said finally. My fiancé died last year influenza. Boston held too many memories. The simple statement, delivered without self-pity, struck Zach deeply. Here was someone who understood loss as he did, who had also sought escape in distance. I'm sorry, he said inadequately. As am I for whatever loss shadows your eyes, Mr. Cole, she replied, meeting his gaze directly. The moment stretched between them, recognition passing silently from one wounded soul to another. Zach found himself wanting to tell her about Sarah, about the life they'd planned, about the emptiness that had driven him west. But the words stuck in his throat, unused to being spoken. Zachariah, he said instead. My name is Zachariah, or Zach to most. A small smile curved Emma's lips. Zachariah, she repeated. A biblical name God has remembered. My mother was religious, he explained, somewhat embarrassed. Hoped I'd follow in my father's footsteps and become a preacher. And instead you became a cowboy, Emma observed. Life seldom follows the paths others set for us. No, it doesn't, Zach agreed, finding unexpected comfort in her understanding. They talked as they finished their coffee, the conversation flowing more easily than Zach could have anticipated. Emma spoke of her teaching, of the children in Sweetwater Creek who hungered for knowledge despite limited resources. Zach found himself sharing stories of the territory, of the beauty and dangers of the land he'd come to know. When he finally rose to leave, night had fully fallen and the temperature had dropped considerably. Thank you for the coffee, he said, standing awkwardly by the door. And the company. You're welcome anytime, Zachariah, Emma replied, her use of his full name sending an unexpected warmth through him. Perhaps next time you'll tell me what brought you to Sweetwater Creek. The gentle challenge in her words caught him off guard. What makes you think there's a story? Everyone who comes west has a story, she said simply. Especially those who carry grief like a shadow. Before he could respond, she opened the door, letting in a blast of cold air that effectively ended the moment. Good night, Mr. Cole. I'm glad the storm spared you. Walking back toward his boarding house, Zach found his thoughts in turmoil. Emma Thorne had seen through him with disconcerting ease, recognizing the pain he thought he'd hidden so carefully. Yet rather than feeling exposed, he felt a strange relief. To be truly seen, perhaps for the first time since Sarah's death, was both terrifying and oddly freeing. The saloon was still lively as he passed, Wade and the other ranch hands visible through the windows. But Zach continued on, his desire for solitude stronger than any need for celebration. He had much to think about, not least the unexpected connection he'd felt with a Boston schoolteacher who carried her own burdens with quiet dignity. As winter settled fully over Sweetwater Creek, life developed a rhythm that Zach found himself adapting to with surprising ease. Work at the Rocking S kept him busy during daylight hours, while evenings increasingly found him in Emma's cottage, sharing coffee and conversation. Their friendship for Zach carefully defined it as nothing more evolved gradually, built on mutual respect and the unspoken understanding of shared loss. Emma never pressed him about Sarah, though he knew she was curious. Instead, she shared pieces of her own past, painting a picture of her life in Boston and the fiancé, Edward, who died before their wedding day. He was kind, she told Zach one evening as snow fell softly outside her window. Steady and dependable, my parents adored him. Did you love him? Zach asked before he could stop himself. Emma considered the question with the honesty he'd come to expect from her. I cared deeply for him, she said finally. We would have had a good life together, but was it the consuming passion poets write about? No, I don't believe it was. Her candor surprised him. Then why did his death drive you west? Because even without that all-consuming love, losing him showed me how fragile life is, she explained. I realized I'd been living the life others expected of me, not the one I truly wanted. And what life is that? Zach asked, genuinely curious. Emma smiled, a determined light in her eyes. One where I make a difference. Where I use my education to help those who wouldn't otherwise have access to learning. Here, children who might never leave this territory still deserve to know about Shakespeare and Euclid and the wider world beyond these mountains. Her passion moved him, so different from the cautious existence he'd constructed since Sarah's death. Emma lived purposefully, her grief a part of her, but not her defining characteristic. As Christmas approached, the town organized a holiday celebration centered around the schoolhouse. Emma threw herself into preparations, enlisting Zach's help with practical matters like hanging decorations and moving furniture to create space for the festivities. "You're becoming quite the public figure," she teased as they worked together one afternoon. "The children no longer whisper when you enter the room." "Progress indeed," Zach replied dryly, though he couldn't deny a certain satisfaction in the way the town's youngest residents had begun to greet him by name rather than staring in wary fascination. The night of the celebration arrived with perfect winter weather, just cold enough for rosy cheeks, but clear skies filled with stars. The schoolhouse glowed with lantern light, evergreen boughs decorating every surface, and the delicious scents of cider and baked goods filling the air. Zach arrived late, having finished his duties at the ranch before changing into his one good shirt and riding into town. He stood awkwardly at the edge of the crowded room, suddenly unsure of his place in this community gathering. Then Emma appeared before him, resplendent in a forest green dress that brought out the color of her eyes. Her hair was arranged more elaborately than usual, with small holly berries woven among the auburn strands. "You came," she said, genuine pleasure in her voice. "Said I would, didn't I?" He replied, feeling strangely nervous under her approving gaze. "Indeed you did, and you clean up remarkably well, Mr. Cole." She took his arm with casual familiarity, guiding him further into the room. "Come, you must try Mrs. Peterson's apple cake. It's divine." The evening passed in a blur of introductions and conversations. Zach found himself drawn into the celebration despite his reservations, even joining in a few carols when Emma insisted everyone participate. The children performed a simple nativity play, their earnest faces bringing unexpected smiles to Zach's usually solemn countenance. As the celebration wound down, families began to depart, bundling sleepy children into wagons for the journey home. Zach stayed behind, helping Emma and a few other teachers dismantle decorations and restore order to the schoolroom. "Leave the rest for tomorrow," Samuel Sawyer advised, appearing at Emma's side as she attempted to reorganize student desks. "You've earned a rest, Miss Thorne." The celebration was a tremendous success. "Thank you, Mr. Sawyer," Emma replied, clearly pleased by the rancher's approval. "Cole," Sawyer nodded to Zach, "see the lady safely home, would you? It's late, and these streets can be treacherous in the dark." "Of course, sir," Zach agreed, ignoring Emma's look of amused tolerance at the men's protective instincts. They walked arm in arm through the quiet town, their breath forming clouds in the cold night air. Stars glittered overhead in a clear sky, and the snow crunched pleasantly beneath their boots. "Did you enjoy yourself?" Emma asked as they approached her cottage. "More than I expected," Zach admitted. "You've created something special here, Emma. The children adore you." "Children are remarkably resilient," she said. "They forgive our shortcomings and see the best in us, often before we see it ourselves." They reached her door, and Emma turned to face him, her expression suddenly serious in the moonlight. "Zachariah, there's something I've been meaning to ask you." His heart quickened unexpectedly. "What is it?" Samuel Sawyer mentioned he's looking for someone to take over the small homestead at the edge of his property. The previous tenant left for California, and the cabin sits empty. Zach blinked, surprised by the unexpected topic. "I've heard him mention it." "He thinks you should consider it," Emma continued. "And so do I." "You want me to become a homesteader?" Zach asked, confused by her interest in his living arrangements. "I want you to consider putting down roots," she clarified. "You've been at the Rocking S longer than anywhere since." "Well, since your loss, perhaps it's time to stop running." The observation, gently delivered but pointed nonetheless, struck a nerve. "I'm not running," he said defensively. Emma's gaze was steady, her voice soft. "Aren't you?" Before he could formulate a response, she continued, "The past doesn't disappear because we keep moving, Zachariah. I learned that on the train west. Wherever we go, we bring ourselves and our grief with us. Some ghosts are harder to face than others," he said quietly. "Yes, they are," she agreed. "But facing them is the only way to truly honor what we've lost." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of her words settling between them. Then Emma reached up and with unexpected gentleness brushed a snowflake from his cheek. "Think about it," she said. "That's all I ask." She disappeared inside her cottage, leaving Zach standing in the snow, more unsettled than he cared to admit. Emma's suggestion that he consider the homestead wasn't just about property, it was about committing to a future, about acknowledging that life continued even after devastating loss. As he rode back to his Spartan room at the boarding house, Zach found his thoughts turning to Sarah. What would she have wanted for him? The answer came with painful clarity. Not this half-life he'd been living, moving from place to place like a ghost himself. For the first time in 3 years, Zach allowed himself to truly consider what it might mean to begin again, not to replace what he'd lost, but to honor it by finding the courage to live fully once more. The following day, he sought out Samuel Sawyer and asked to see the homestead. January brought bitter cold, and the kind of isolation only a Montana winter could impose. The homestead Zach had decided to lease from Sawyer with the option to buy if he stayed through the year sat nestled against a stand of pines at the edge of rocking S property. The cabin was sturdier than it appeared from outside, with a good stone fireplace and tight construction that kept out the worst of the wind. The work of making it habitable occupied Zach's evenings after long days at the ranch. He repaired loose floorboards, replaced broken window glass, and constructed simple furniture from lumber hauled from town. The physical labor was satisfying, giving purpose to hours that had previously been filled with memories and regret. Emma visited occasionally, bringing small housewarming gifts, a patchwork quilt for his bed, curtains she'd sewn for the windows, books to fill empty shelves. Her presence transformed the cabin, adding warmth that went beyond the physical comfort of the items she provided. "It's coming along nicely," she observed one Sunday afternoon, having ridden out with Sawyer and his foreman after church services. "You have a talent for this, Zachariah." Zach shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise but pleased nonetheless. "Had a lot of practice. Built our first home in Colorado from the ground up." It was the first time he'd mentioned his life with Sarah so directly to Emma, and he saw the recognition flash in her eyes. But she didn't press, merely nodding as she moved to examine a chair he'd recently completed. "Sturdy craftsmanship," she commented, running her hand along the smooth wood. "You build things to last." "Try to," he agreed, watching her move about his space with a sense of rightness he couldn't explain. As winter slowly gave way to spring, Zach found himself looking forward to Emma's visits with increasing anticipation. She brought news from town, books they discussed during quiet evenings by the fire, and most importantly, a companionship he hadn't realized how desperately he'd missed. One evening in early April, as they sat on his newly constructed porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple, Emma shared news that sent an unexpected jolt of alarm through him. "I've been offered a position at a school in Denver," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "The salary is twice what I earn here and they have a proper library." Zach felt as though the ground had shifted beneath him. "Denver," he repeated, the word tasting bitter on his tongue. "When would you leave?" "The term begins in September," she replied. "I haven't accepted yet." "But you're considering it," he said, not a question but a statement. Emma turned to look at him directly, her expression serious. "I came west to make a difference, Zachariah. In Denver, I could reach more students, have better resources. The children here need you too," he argued, aware of the selfishness behind his words but unable to stop them. "Yes, they do," she agreed softly. "But is that reason enough to stay?" The question hung between them as darkness fell, bringing with it a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. Zach wanted to tell her not to go, to ask her to stay for the children, for the town, for him. But what right did he have to make such a request? They were friends, nothing more, despite the feelings he'd begun to acknowledge in the privacy of his own thoughts. "You should do what's best for you," he said finally, the words costing him more than he could express. Emma nodded, though disappointment flickered briefly across her face. "That's what I've always tried to do," she replied, rising from her chair. "I should head back before it gets too dark." Zach accompanied her to where her horse was tethered, helping her mount with hands that wanted to linger but didn't dare. "I'll ride with you," he offered. "Safer that way." The journey to town passed in relative silence, each lost in their own thoughts. When they reached Emma's cottage, she dismounted without assistance, her movements betraying a new distance between them. "Thank you for the escort," she said formally. "Emma," Zach began, then faltered, unsure what he wanted to say. She waited, her face upturned to his, moonlight silvering her features. When he remained silent, she sighed softly. "Good night, Zachariah," she said, turning toward her door. "Don't go to Denver," he blurted, the words escaping before he could reconsider. Emma paused, her back still to him. "Why not?" The simple question demanded an honest answer, one Zach wasn't sure he was ready to give. But losing her without at least trying to express what she'd come to mean to him seemed suddenly unbearable. "Because I'd miss you," he said, the admission both inadequate and monumental. "Because when I'm with you, the world doesn't seem so empty anymore." Emma turned slowly to face him, her expression guarded. "That's not enough, Zachariah, not for me." "What would be enough?" he asked, stepping closer. "I need someone who isn't afraid to love again," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "Someone who sees me as more than safe company in a lonely world." Her words struck him like a physical blow, all the more painful for their truth. Had he been using Emma as a shield against true feeling, enjoying her company while keeping his heart safely distant? "You deserve better than that," he acknowledged. "Better than me." "I don't want better," Emma replied, a hint of frustration entering her tone. "I want you, Zachariah, the real you, not the shadow who's been hiding from life for 3 years. The directness of her statement left him speechless. Emma shook her head, a sad smile touching her lips. "Think about what you really want," she said. "Because Denver isn't just about a teaching position, it's about whether there's a reason compelling enough to stay." With that, she disappeared into her cottage, leaving Zach alone with the enormity of what had just transpired between them. The following weeks brought a flurry of activity to Sweetwater Creek. Spring roundup kept Zach and the other ranch hands busy from dawn until dusk, while Emma prepared her students for end-of-term examinations. They saw little of each other, the conversation outside her cottage hanging unresolved between them. Zach threw himself into work, using physical exhaustion to quiet the tumult of his thoughts. But at night, alone in the cabin he'd worked so hard to make habitable, he found himself confronting questions he'd avoided for too long. Could he love again? Did he even remember how? And if he did, was it a betrayal of Sarah and the life they'd planned together? One particularly restless night, Zach found himself digging through his saddlebags, searching for something he hadn't looked at in years. At the bottom, carefully wrapped in oilcloth, was a daguerreotype of Sarah on their wedding day. Her smile, frozen in time, looked out at him across the years that separated them. "What would you want for me?" he asked the image softly. Of course, there was no answer. But as he studied the face of the woman he'd loved so completely, Zach found himself remembering not just her death, but her life, her laughter, her dreams, her fierce joy in simple pleasures. Sarah had loved life too much to want anyone to stop living because of her absence. The realization came not as a sudden epiphany, but as a quiet certainty that had perhaps been growing in him all along. The next morning, Zach requested a few days' leave from Sawyer, who granted it with a knowing look but no questions. Packing minimal supplies, Zach set out on Thunder, riding south and east toward a destination he hadn't visited in 3 long years. The journey to the small Colorado cemetery took 4 days of hard riding. When Zach finally dismounted before the wrought iron gates, his body ached with fatigue, but his mind was clearer than it had been in years. Sarah's grave lay beneath a cottonwood tree, the simple marker bearing her name, the dates of her birth and death, and the words "beloved wife." Zach knelt beside it, removing his hat as he traced the letters with his fingertips. "I should have come sooner," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm sorry, Sarah." For a long time, he simply sat beside the grave, letting memories wash over him, their first meeting at a church social, the way she'd laughed when he proposed beside the creek where they'd later build their home, the feel of her hand in his as they'd planned their future. I met someone, he said finally. Her name is Emma. She's nothing like you. She's from Boston, educated, teaches school, but she has your spirit, your kindness. The admission felt strange yet right, as if Sarah herself were listening from somewhere beyond his understanding. I've been afraid, he continued. Afraid that loving her would mean losing you all over again, afraid of the pain if something happened to her too. A gentle breeze stirred the cottonwood leaves, sending dappled shadows dancing across the grave marker. Zach took a deep breath, the scent of spring filling his lungs. But that's not what you'd want for me, is it? You always said life was for living, even when it hurt. In the silence that followed, Zach felt something shift within him, not a dramatic transformation, but the quiet settling of a decision long in the making. He would always love Sarah, would always carry the grief of her loss. But perhaps there was room in his heart for new love, new beginnings. I'll always keep you here, he said, touching his chest above his heart. But I think it's time I stopped just surviving and started living again. He stayed until sunset, saying a proper goodbye to the woman who had been his first love. When he finally rode away, Zach felt lighter than he had in years, as if a burden he'd carried for so long had not disappeared, but had somehow become manageable. The return journey to Sweetwater Creek seemed shorter, urgency driving him forward. He arrived in town just as news was spreading of Emma's decision regarding the Denver position. She's accepted, Mrs. Whitaker informed him when he stopped at the boarding house to inquire. Made the announcement at the school board meeting last night, leaving end of August. Zach thanked her for the information, his heart sinking despite his newfound resolve. Had he realized his feelings too late? The thought spurred him toward Emma's cottage, heedless of the dust from the trail that still clung to his clothes. She answered his knock with surprise, her eyes widening at his travel-worn appearance. Zachariah, I heard you'd left town. May I come in? He asked, suddenly aware of his disheveled state. I need to talk to you. Emma hesitated briefly, then stepped aside to allow him entry. You look exhausted, she observed, concern evident in her voice despite the formality of her manner. Where have you been? Colorado, he replied, watching comprehension dawn in her eyes. I went to visit Sarah's grave. Emma's expression softened. After 3 years, what changed? I did, Zach said simply. Or rather, I'm trying to. He removed his hat, running a hand through his travel-mussed hair. I heard about Denver. Congratulations. Thank you, Emma replied, though her tone lacked the enthusiasm such an opportunity should inspire. It's a wonderful position. Is it what you want? He asked directly. Emma met his gaze steadily. It's a good opportunity, she repeated, avoiding a direct answer. That's not what I asked, Zach pressed, taking a step closer. Emma, is Denver what you truly want? What I want, she said carefully, is a life with purpose, a chance to make a difference, and... She hesitated, then continued with quiet determination, someone to share that life with who isn't afraid of the future. Someone like me, Zach asked, scarcely daring to hope. Perhaps, Emma acknowledged, if you're ready, if you truly want that too. Zach took her hands in his, the contact sending warmth through his travel-weary body. I can't promise I won't still carry grief, he said honestly. Sarah will always be part of me. But these past months with you have shown me there can be joy again, purpose beyond just surviving day to day. Emma's fingers tightened around his. I would never ask you to forget her, Zachariah. Our pasts make us who we are. And who I am, he continued, gathering courage, is a man who's fallen in love with a Boston schoolteacher who challenges him, inspires him, and makes him want to be better than he is. Tears shimmered in Emma's eyes, but she didn't look away. Are you certain? Because I won't accept less than your whole heart, Zachariah, not parts kept safely distant, not affection born of convenience or fear of being alone. I'm offering everything I have, he said simply. It may be scarred, but it's yours if you want it. For a moment, Emma studied his face as if searching for any hint of reservation. Whatever she saw must have satisfied her, because she stepped closer, eliminating the space between them. I turned down Denver this morning, she admitted, before I knew you'd returned. I realized I couldn't leave Sweetwater Creek, couldn't leave you without knowing if there might be something worth staying for. Joy surged through Zach, unexpected and overwhelming. And is there? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. In answer, Emma raised herself on tiptoes and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, then deepened as Zach pulled her closer, pouring 3 years of loneliness and newfound hope into the embrace. When they finally parted, both breathing unevenly, Emma smiled up at him with a radiance that made his heart ache in the best possible way. "I believe there is," she said softly. In the months that followed, Sweetwater Creek witnessed the gradual transformation of two individuals marked by loss into a couple defined by hope. Zach continued work on his homestead while Emma prepared for another school year, but their evenings were spent together, building a shared life piece by piece. By summer's end, the cabin had become a home, with Emma's books filling the shelves Zach had built and her touch evident in every corner. They were married in the schoolhouse on a perfect September day, with the entire town turning out to celebrate the union of their beloved teacher and the once solitary cowboy who'd found his way back to life through her love. Samuel Sawyer offered Zach full ownership of the homestead as a wedding gift, a gesture that moved the normally stoic cowboy to uncharacteristic emotion. "You've earned it, son," Sawyer said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Both the land and the happiness." As winter approached once more, Emma sat beside Zach on their porch, watching the first snowflakes of the season drift lazily from a pewter sky. Her hand rested on her slightly rounded belly, where their child dew in the spring grew stronger each day. "Are you happy?" she asked, breaking the comfortable silence between them. Zach covered her hand with his own, feeling the simple gold band on her finger that matched the one he wore. "More than I believed possible," he answered truthfully. "Does it still hurt?" she asked, her question encompassing all the grief and loss that had shaped his journey to her. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But differently now, it's part of me, not all of me." Emma nodded, understanding in her eyes. "I've been thinking of names," she said, changing the subject with gentle purpose. "If it's a girl, perhaps Sarah." Zach's breath caught at the unexpected suggestion. "You wouldn't mind. She was your first love, and she helped make you the man I love now," Emma said simply. "It would be an honor to her memory." Overwhelmed by the generosity of spirit that defined his wife, Zach pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her temple. "And if it's a boy?" he asked when he could trust his voice again. "Edward," Emma suggested. "After my father, not my fiancé," she clarified with a small smile. "Though I think he would approve too." As darkness fell and the snow began to accumulate in earnest, they moved inside to the warmth of their fireplace. Zach added logs to the flames while Emma prepared a simple supper, the domestic rhythm they'd established feeling both ordinary and miraculous. Later, as they lay together in the darkness of their bedroom, Zach traced patterns on Emma's skin, marveling at the journey that had brought them to this moment. From the depths of grief to the heights of joy, from solitude to partnership, from merely existing to truly living. "I love you, Emma Cole," he whispered against her hair. "And I love you, Zachariah Cole," she replied, her voice warm with sleep and contentment. "Today, tomorrow, and all the days to come." As his wife drifted into sleep beside him, Zach reflected on the words Henry Baldwin had spoken during that snowbound night in the trapper's cabin, about second chances often going unrecognized until they were staring you in the face. How right the railroad man had been, and how fortunate Zach was to have finally opened his eyes to the blessing that had walked into his life that day outside the general store. The grief that had once defined him hadn't disappeared, it had transformed, becoming part of the foundation upon which he and Emma were building their future together. Sarah would always be a cherished memory, but Emma was his present and future, a gift he'd never expected but now couldn't imagine living without. Outside, snow continued to fall on the Montana landscape, covering the world in pristine white. But inside the cabin, Zachariah Cole had built with his own hands. Warmth and love prevailed, promising seasons of joy to come for the cowboy who had thought his grief would never end, until she brought him a second chance at love.